on puff pastry, but I just want to concentrate on this. It's just on dough development, maybe a little bit of ingredient functionality of what is in the bowl, and the reason I'm making the puff pastry dough today for tomorrow. So if I just go down and have a look at the ingredient pool, and you can see here I've got the flour. I'm using baker's flour. Sometimes they have pastry flour, but just a little bit weaker than baker's flour, and potentially the particle size might be a little bit smaller, but essentially it's, baker's flour makes, very good puff pastry. I've then got vinegar, salt, and fat. The reason the vinegar is in there is we have this issue when we make puff pastry and store it, and the plan is for us to make the puff pastry tomorrow, laminate, and we're going to hold some of our puff pastry for the assessment. So because I'm going to be freezing and thawing, this will stop that black spot or that discoloration in the puff pastry dough. And the vinegar is also, it does help with, with gluten, conditioning the gluten. So the vinegar goes in. And then I've got salt. Salt's critical in puff pastry. Salt, obviously for flavor, puff pastry without salt is pretty, it tastes pretty ordinary, a little bit like chips without salt. But the main function in there is it toughens gluten. So the salt has an effect on that gluten network. So there's two proteins in the flour, glutenin and gliadin, and the salt has an effect on that gluten development, which we need for a very strong matrix for what we're doing when we go through that laminating process. The salt also has a bit of an anti-mold inhibitor. It's not very effective for that. Vinegar is certainly a way better, for a natural option. There's lots of powders and deactivated yeasts and a whole bunch of things that they use in manufacturing to stop that spotting or mold, or even yeast from being created. So the salt goes in. And then I've got some fat. So a portion of the fat is in the dough. This is good for beginners when we start making the puff pastry dough. But, in industry, depending on what it's used for, the fat will either be all in the laminating, or it will be in the laminating fat, which is the incorporated fat. But sometimes a portion of the fat can go in the dough, which makes it a little bit more elastic and easy to do that laminating process. So with the puff pastry dough, we have, and we'll be talking more about this when we get to yeasted goods, which is the next unit. When we talk about baker's percentages, with puff pastry, you've got 100% of flour and 50% water, which the jargon is that we will call this hydration. So there's a few things that are happening now to this dough. Is those two gluten proteins, when I add energy and add water, they will form a network. We call it, the jargon is a matrix, a gluten matrix. And we will form those two proteins together. So I've got two proteins, and if you can think about an elastic band, I'm creating like those two proteins together, which give that tenacity or the ability to stretch and to return. And that's the nature of gluten. The other thing that's happening is that the starch in the flour is also absorbing this liquid. So the starch is hydrating, the gluten is forming, and unlike our shortbread doughs, where we were very careful when we mixed, in this case, we want to develop the dough. We want to develop some of that protein and form a network. And this will form the base of our puff pastry dough. I'm just holding back a little bit of the water, which is fairly standard when we're making doughs. And what's really critical with puff pastry is that we get, there's a few things. All these ingredients are cold. I'm using water at 8 degrees. The bag of flour came out of the fridge. The butter's cold. I want to keep everything very cold. And it's the main reason why making the dough today for production tomorrow, that is the professional way to make puff pastry. It's not normal to make puff pastry and laminate and do your rolling and shaping and forming and filling and baking in a 5-hour period. The best performance that you'll get out of puff pastry is when it's well rested, the dough's been developed correctly, and that laminating has, is very accurate. So going back to that point, important points. One I mentioned was ingredients cold. The ingredients are cold and they're compatible with each other. So the butter will be cold, the dough is very cold, so that's compatible. The other one is the texture has to be the same. If I'm going to blend two things together and maintain fine sheets of fat and dough, it's critical that the dough has the same sort of firmness and it's able to stretch evenly with those butter sheets. So that second point is that the dough and the fat need to be compatible. So I'm going to check the consistency before I add any extra water. And even though the dough is not fully formed, I can make judgment. And I can see there's flour on the bottom that hasn't been incorporated. But if I feel the dough, and the way, when you're testing dough for hydration, you don't do this. This doesn't tell you anything. You really need to grab hold of it, and you need to, you're making a judgment on the consistency of that dough. And it's a fairly tight dough. Like bread, this has got 50% water. Bread, for example, has, from 60% all the way to 90%, with the more wetter style doughs or long fermented doughs. So this type of machine that I'm using here, we will be using this for our bread unit, the yeasted unit. So it's a good opportunity to sort of have a look at how that operates. You can see that this machine is called a spiral mixer, and it's designed for making doughs. The type of machine that we're using in class is called a planetary mixer, which does whipping, beating, and kneading. And it's not really an effective. Machine for kneading dough. It will make dough, but this dough is designed for making bread doughs. So of course, with all doughs, we want to make the best possible bread, pastry, anything that we're making. Then it's important to use the right machine for that. So this is nearly finished its first phase of mixing, which is in first gear. And that first phase is really about hydration, forming gluten, hydrating the starch, and getting that consistency right. The second phase, which is what I'm going to start now, I'm just going to have a feel of that dough. It feels very nice. So it's got the right sort of texture. It's soft yet firm. And, if we're using this with a sheet of butter, it's really important that we don't make this too tight, because that'll be very difficult to laminate. And it's also important too that we don't make it too soft. That also creates a lot of issues. So now I'm on the second phase. So you can see that the speed has changed, right? See if I can get, yep. And now the mixing process is a bit different. This is now dough development. And what I want to do with this dough for our puff pastry is develop a strong network, strong gluten network, for us to roll and extend and sheet for this puff pastry dough. Now, I've got the timer set for 8 minutes, but I might not necessarily need to mix that long. That's normally the setting for a bread dough. So the puff pastry dough doesn't need to be developed as much as a puff pastry. Sorry, a puff pastry dough doesn't need to be developed as extensively as a bread dough, because don't forget, when we're putting this dough on the dough sheeter and we're rolling and folding, and we do that, we're going to roll and fold 5 half turns. The gluten is being worked every time. So every time we stretch it and fold it, the gluten network is stretching, and it's being stretched to capacity, and that's why we need to rest that puff pastry in between turns. Right? So it's really important with that, with the lessons this week, that we understand that cold ingredients, the two parts of the dough and the fat, they need to be compatible in temperature and consistency, and that we're incorporating a resting system between turns. So you might see with the mixing, the dough looks a little bit different, and it's chunking around that spiral a little bit different. And what I'm aiming for is to develop a dough that's shiny, a little bit elastic, not too elastic, but enough that I've developed some gluten. I have a look now, and I take some dough, and I'm just going to flatten it a bit, and I start to stretch it. You can see that I have some gluten properties developed, but you can also see that it's a bit unclear is probably the term, but it's ripping very easy. And again, I don't want to develop this like a bread dough where it's fully developed. We're going to save a little bit of that for the dough sheeter. But if I keep on stretching, you can see that now I'm starting to get a gluten matrix or a gluten network. It's not a very good one, but I can start to stretch it out to a fine skin. And we'll be doing this a lot when we do bread making. And that's really just checking the gluten development. Mix that longer. I'll probably do this for another 2 minutes, and we'll just have a check and see what that development looks like. Just while that's mixing, I'm just going to go to the PowerPoint for the lesson. It's just mixing in the background. I'll give it a few minutes. So we've got the lesson for puff pastry, butter puff pastry. It's the main thing. It's the number one thing. We're doing filo pastry, but that doesn't require very much knowledge at all. There's a bit of skill in forming, but we're not. We will look at extensible doughs a little bit later, proper strudel dough, but we're just pretty much just really making sure we cover what we need for the assessment. Oh, just go back one. So just to review, there's methods of incorporating fat into the dough. There's spotting and sheeting, right? And you might remember that there's some historical, cultural references to the different methods of incorporating fat into the dough. English method, Scottish method, French method. If I get a chance, I'll show you the French method tomorrow. But for us, the English method is the most effective. Again, just making sure that the dough and fat are equal consistency. and we need to rest puff pastry. The products that we're making this week, we're making vol au vents. We're going to put a chicken filling into those vol au vents. That chicken filling is we have to make a cooked filling. That's something that I need to tick off on that unit. Like there needs to be some cooked filling. You know, we did some pie fillings and things like that in the, when we did the quiches, we did make some pies, but we need to do a cooked filling. Of course, those cooked fillings need to be labeled. They need to be cooled. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the theory session, where I'll just be concentrating on the practical assessment, which is the following week, where we will be doing the phyllo strudel passes. We'll be doing that with cream cheese and cherries. And any leftover scrap we'll be making palmiers. Again, out of this block, we want to produce the puff pastry for the lesson. We want to produce some puff pastry, a sheet for the assessment. And then just going back to those important points, we've got the dough must be cold, right? Cold water, cold ingredients. Dough laminating fat needs to be the same consistency. You've got to give the right amount of turn. So you want to remember me cutting the pastry and looking at the inside. It's on the other video, in fact. So we have to make sure that we have the right amount of layers of fat and dough, and that they're paper thin. So keeping a control on the number of turns. Cross pinning, which was rolling one way, turning and rolling the other way. We'll review that. It's on the other video. Don't overdust. I'm making sure that when we fold that pastry over, that it does seal, that those layers seal, and that when we roll it out, they continue to make sheets of dough and fat. We'll be using the pastry docker again to reduce lift, and we'll be doing that for the base of the vol au vents. A resting regime, while we're pinning, the more rest, the better. So if I make the dough today, it gets 24 hours rest, it is way better puff pastry, way better. And it just rules out shrinkage, right? Which is pretty devastating when the process is so it's a long process, right? And then the baking, right? I'll cover the baking in class. Just going to stop sharing now. We're going to have a look at this dough. Right, you can see that the dough looks different, right? It's a lot shinier. And I mentioned about shine and how important that is. You can see that it's a lot clearer as well, right? It's less torn. I'm just going to flatten that out so we can have a look at see how much gluten we have been able to develop in this dough. You see, I'm just gently stretching it out, and this is really just a way of testing dough development. Developing those two gluten proteins. And I'm not going to take it further. It's still, if it was a bread dough, I would definitely mix it for about another 3 minutes. But you can see that I'm able to now, if I'm careful, you can see it just tore. That it doesn't have the tenacity of a well-developed bread dough, nor do I want it to, because we still need to do this on the dough sheeter. If you imagine how I'm stretching that sheet, we're doing that on the dough sheeter, but we're putting a very fine piece of fat in there. So you can see, I don't know whether you can see, but I can see my fingerprint under that tiny sheet of dough. And that is good gluten development. Happens on second speed. And now this dough, I'm going to portion it up into boxes so that when we start the lesson, we really just are concentrating on lamination. Because once we do the incorporation method, which we'll use the English method or sheeting, and after that we've just got lamination, and that is a high order skill set, right? We don't have much time. We're really packing in. We're packing in this education. You know, that 6 hours that we have. I want to fill it as much as I can, which is the reason why I'm taking the effort to do this. I'm going to call that. So that is dough development. When I see you guys this week, that there's two main things, right? We've got lamination and making this puff pastry, just following that regime, getting that puff pastry piece out for the assessment, and we'll be able to assess if there's any issues by the baked products that we're making. And then in theory later on, we're just concentrating on the assessment, right? And that is a workflow, right? Making sure that we're organized, we know what we're doing, we know we're making choux pastry, we know when we're doing the pastry, and that we can do that assessment successfully in time, making as the best products that you can. Right.